I've been promising to do a shop tour for quite a while and finally have it kind of clean, so what the heck, let's go ahead and give that a try. So obviously the most important bit, first of all, is the shop cat, who, if he's not allowed inside when he knows someone is out here, becomes extremely loud and definitely makes himself known. So for the sake of having a relatively quiet bit of audio for here, he is allowed in the shop right now. And I'm sure he'll be forcing himself into view multiple times in the future during this video. So right in the doorway, got one of my project machines. This is an old die filer. So when the pulley here spins, the file holder there starts oscillating up and down. And normally there would be this big overarm piece that holds the top of the file and helps guide it, keeps it vertical. That goes in that mount right there, except this one's missing it, hence project machine. So at some point I'll be fabricating one of those to go with it. And then one of several pedestal grinders. I'm still debating which wheels and to put on it and where I want it, so it's just kind of sitting here at the moment. Newest addition to the shop is a 14.5-inch Scher Tumico optical comparator. Which is, if you're not familiar with them, it's kind of like a old overhead projector, except it's projecting on what should be a piece of glass right in through here with a bunch of different measuring lines for angles or what have you, depending on what you're measuring. And this one's got 20 and I think 100x zoom lenses with it. And I should have new glass coming for that later this week. It just hasn't arrived quite yet. Not a tool I have to have, but the price was right, and it'll be useful from time to time, particularly when I'm doing, say, threads or something like that, where I've got small features I need to be able to measure accurately and make sure they're actually what I want them to be. One of many sections of very full storage of random odds and ends that are mostly organized to the point that I know where things are, even if it doesn't necessarily look like that. And then one of my shop-built projects. This is eventually going to be a hopper-fed CNC lathe, so I can load up code and just have it self-feed a bunch from a stack of wood to turn out spindle after spindle with the same profile. And then my heat treating oven for steel. This one's almost a 2-foot cubic interior on it with a programmable Bartlett controller on it, so I can do, I think it's 5 steps of heating cycles on it. So you can do different ramp up temperature rates, hold the temperature, and so on to get a proper heat treat for it. And then another pedestal grinder currently in the way. And then the big Cincinatti Cinova Cat 50 milling machine. This one has hydraulic power feed on all the axes with rapids by the big lever right here. When you got it running, just lift that up and it goes into rapid mode. That's pretty much the machine I use when I need to hog out a bunch of metal, like one sitting there, but railroad ties I was converting into anvils. I've got a big, I think that's a 5-inch face mill on it that just plows right across the top, gives a nice flat finish to them. And then just some temporary guards to help try and contain the chips a little bit. Makes a bit of a mess with them still, but without them I get chips pretty much everywhere in the shop. They go remarkably far. And then back to the cat, sitting on the old Northfield table saw, which I probably should rebuild. The main issue it has are the motor bearings are completely shot. But in the meantime, it makes a great outfeed table for the main table saw over there. It's like a almost 3-foot by 4-foot slab of cast iron. Nice and stable, doesn't go anywhere obviously because it weighs almost 2,000 pounds. The other option I may do for it, instead of making it back into a working table saw, since I'm missing the fence that would go right there anyway, is mount a router inside there and make a really fancy router table out of it. You then have height change by the wheel on the front, as well as the ability to tilt the router to do different profiles that way. I've looked into a little bit, and I'm pretty sure I can do that without actually modifying the table saw itself in any sort of permanent way. So it could be undone and put it back to how it was originally. Then my Nagase SGW-63 12-inch by 24-inch surface grinder. So it's actually probably metric dimensions, but anyway. Hydraulic power feed on the axes, plus has spark out modes, and the head will drop down by a given number of passes. Not really computer controlled, but it is automatic at least. And then unfortunately currently sitting in parts is my Cincinatti Bickford Super Service 24 drill press with the 5 horsepower gear head. Don't know if it'll quite tell in the video, but the issue is I have about 8.5 foot ceilings, and this is about 7.5 or 8 foot tall, so it would fit, except I don't have enough clearance to actually lift that head up above it to put it into place. And I have so far failed to figure out a way to actually make that fit in here. So it may unfortunately be stuck waiting until the next shop, when I hopefully have higher ceilings and that's no longer an issue. And then we get to the Monarch 613 metal lathe. I forget how many horsepower. I want to say 15 or 20 on here. Either way, though, it's a beast. Originally it would have gone down to 12 RPM, but there's a bad gear that cost me 12, 14, and 16 RPM, and then another 3 in the middle. So I go from 18 to 1500 RPM on it, along with more threads than I need, going from 2 all the way up to 120 threads per inch. And no gear change is required for that. You just flip a few levers and spin that dial to select whichever thread size you want on it, which is definitely nice. And then to go along with the Cincinatti, when I need something that's either a little bit easier to move around or a little bit more flexible, got a Bridgeport style knee mill. This one's by Summit, 2 horsepower, variable speed head, power feed on the x-axis, manual on the others. Pretty much the same as a Bridgeport style mill, just it's a little bit heavier frame from what I've heard than most of them. This one's about 2,900 pounds or so, I think. And then Harbor Freight 20-ton hydraulic press and sandblasting cabinet. Nothing fancy either of them, but they get the job done well enough when they need to. Another project machine that mostly works at this point, but it needs new chucks and whatnot on it. For some reason, it came with ones that didn't actually fit it. But it's a Burgmaster 6-position turret drill. So basically, each time you would plunge down to drill a hole, when it comes back up, that orange head there will spin around to go to the next taper on there. So you can do, say, spot drill, small drill, big drill, tap, chamfer, all in one setup without having to swap bits in and out constantly. I'm not sure if it's stock or if someone modified it in the past, but this one's actually got numeric control on it. Very old rudimentary system, but you can program speeds and dwell times and all that sort of thing for your whole cycle. So you just push one button and it'll run through all your bits at whatever rates you want. Then we've got one of my tool and cutter grinders. This one's a radial one. So rather than everything moving side to side, you've got a latch here. You loosen that, and then the main holding head here can pivot around, so you can do radial curves, and it's also got a powered head up top there. And then like other tool and cutter grinders, you've got linear movement as well by the hand wheels. Sure, a little bit stiff at the moment, haven't oiled it in a while, I need to get to that. As well as movement for the head itself. And then most of my tooling for the Cincinatti, all Cat 50. Bunch of collets and end mill holders and a whole bunch of boring heads just because big bulk lot at an auction was real cheap. Figured they'd be useful one of these days. And then we've got another one of my project machines I need to figure out how to set up and run. Would be a Giddings & Lewis drill bit grinder. This one's mostly, I believe, designed to do bigger bits like my Morse taper bits and whatnot. And you can do various fancier than just basic tip points on there. They're supposed to be a little bit better about centering and whatnot. But basically profiling more than just a straight edge on there. I just need to figure out how to actually run it. And another big pedestal grinder. I seem to have collected a lot of those over the years, but what the heck, they're useful to have. Then we've got my hollow chisel mortiser, which in this case is a Monarch X1B, I believe, or XB1. I can never remember which way that goes. But the unique thing with it is it's got a foot pedal rather than the usual lever arm, so it keeps your hands free when you're running it. Really wish most of that's, to my mind, a much better way of controlling things. But it is also very top heavy. In fact, it's one of the only machines here that's tried to kill me while moving it. So it absolutely has to be bolted down or it will not stay upright when you want it to. Then beside that, we've got one of the more unique little bandsaws I've got. This one's a Makita. It's only 16-inch wheels, and as you can see, it's probably about 10 inches or so shorter than the Grizzly 513, and yet it runs these absolutely massive 2.5-inch wide, partially carbide toothed blades on it, which, as you can imagine, having a blade that wide makes for very easy straight cuts when you're resawing. But to make it more weird than just being a small, really stout saw, it's just got this weird little universal motor on the back here, which doesn't have quite as much power as it probably should, and it squeals horribly when you're running it. So one of these days I'm probably going to pull that off and swap out an induction motor for it, like a lot of people apparently do. But it resaws great, pretty much on par with a well-tuned bandsaw like a Laguna Resaw King, except a little bit easier to keep things straight. And then beside it, we've got 3 regular bandsaws, or relatively regular anyway. Standard Grizzly 513, and then an old Northfield 27-inch. Both of those are 2 horsepower, about 12 inches of resaw. Need to swap blades around them, but I've got blades to put a 1/8 inch on one of them and a 3/8 on the other as general purpose. And then before I got the Makita, the Woodtech here was my resaw bandsaw because it's got about 14 or 15 inches and a little bit more horsepower than the other two. Not quite sure what I'll set up the third bandsaw for as far as blade size, but figure out something later on. And then before I forget, obviously every wood shop has to have a table saw. In this case, I've got a Shopfox W1762. It's a 12-inch blade with a 7.5 horsepower 3-phase motor on it. And then I picked up an Excalibur overarm guard for it. A little bit better dust collection, and the guard is never really off the saw. You just push it out of the way when you don't need it. So it's still right there to be pulled right back when you do. So it's less likely to get ignored and not installed. Then I also added a Wixie digital fence gauge to it, so you can easily see exactly what dimension you're at. Not strictly necessary, it just makes it a lot easier to know the exact correct measurement. You can zero it out when you put a dado stack on it, which is really handy for making sure you're not having to do math on calculating dimensions based upon how wide your dado stack is. And it also makes it very easy to go back and redo a measurement you had earlier. Then we've got another grinder. This one is a Cao Ming tool and cutter grinder. Pretty much, I think, just a clone of a Cincinatti No. 2. So you've got your, actually separate, you've got planetary gearbox in there for fine feed control. And then when you push that in, that disables that one and enables this one for faster, basically rapids and non-rapids in a manual form. Then you've got another handwheel for going in and out, and on the back here is the handwheel for moving the grinder head up and down. Then we've got the Oliver I think it's a 16B pattermaker lathe. This one came out of Detroit from a guy that bought it intending just to use the legs for table, then he realized the lathe itself was in still mostly usable shape that was extremely ugly under like 6 layers of flaking paint at that time. So he didn't want to just scrap it, and I ended up picking that up off Craigslist. It does have the carriage, that would be the pattern maker part. It's very similar to a metal lathe carriage, but I didn't have any real need for that with the work I do, and it was very bulky and ate up a lot of swing and just kept getting in the way, so I took it off for now. Then the motor down there's got a 4-speed gearbox coupled with the 4 speeds on the step pulleys. So you've got 16 total speeds available to you on it. And we come around here and we've got a Porter 622 overarm pin router, which runs, I believe, 10,000 RPMs currently. I know you can adjust the belt, but I don't remember for sure which mode I've got in. But basically you've got a foot pedal down there, and when you step on that, the head moves up and down. And when you're using it, you'd have one of these pins inserted in the table here, and that's what will follow your template underneath the stock, and then you're cutting it above it so you can see the bit clearly. And one other kind of interesting trick they did on it, if I can come around here enough for you to see it. That flex hose there is ducted underneath the bottom of the motor where the coolant fan is. So you actually get a nice strong air blast from there to clear your chips away. Puts out a surprising amount of air there. Does a good job keeping everything clear so you can actually see what you're doing nice and easy. And for his third visit on film so far, we have the cat again. And coming around, we've got the 36-inch wide belt sander I had to rewire. Picked that up from a flooring contractor who'd bought it from someone, and then for whatever reason they ended up never using it, and they got in their head that rather than try to sell it as a working machine, they would just scrap it, which apparently meant their maintenance guy pulled the big motor out of it and cut all the wires to the motor in half. Everything worked though, so when I got it, I managed to get the motor remounted, traced out the wires, and spliced them back together properly, and ended up with a working 36-inch wide belt for $300. Need to zip tie things, but I also reworked how the tensioner on the feed belt there works. Before, when it was tensioned, which it normally is, it would just bleed air out there constantly. And I reworked the pneumatic logic there so it only bleeds air when it's letting tension off rather than holding tension on. Just reduce the air consumption and the noise level a good bit, and it still works as intended. And currently working it as a big horizontal surface, we have my DFDA Shaper. I believe this one's 5 horsepower, single spindle, just a very large table on it for lots of support. 1 1/4 inch spindle. Then in the back here, recent project, are new push blocks for jointers. So mending plate on the bottom instead of the foam that most of them have. Well, it does leave a slight mark on the wood that planes right out in the next step, but it holds great without any slippage, and they don't wear out. I've got a set I've been using for about 10 years, and it's still just as good and useful as when it was new. And we made both the single mending plate size, it's about the size of a regular joint push block, as well as this bigger double one that gives you a 3 by 12 inch area, and you can use it single or double-handed, which is actually my favorite one at the moment. We've got just a basic rotary table for the mills. Bunch of unusually colorful holly, which isn't really what you normally would want for holly, but what the heck, it was pretty. So I got that here drying out, as well as some figured wood for a couple small projects. And then my 2 radial arm saws currently suffering from horizontal surfacitis, as you can see. But 16-inch blades on them, I think 5 and 7.5 horsepower motors. And they're old enough and heavy enough that they actually are, I won't say safe, but not unsafe at least. And once you got them dialed in, they make a nice accurate cut over and over again with a very wide cross cut. I think like 26 inches or so of cross cut. Then we come around to the Redden Ekstrom edge sander. Not quite sure on the model number for this, but I believe it's from around 1914, 1917, somewhere in that ballpark range. One of their earlier designs. Mostly cleaned up again, but got a little bit more to do. I need to put the end table back on and make some dust shrouds so it doesn't leave the entire shop quite so covered in dust as it currently does. Not going to try running things one-handed, but I may put up another video later. But the oscillating part of it is this big butterfly hinge mechanism. So off the bottom of the main drive motor, there's this flat belt coming off that goes around this big wagon wheel looking piece. And an eccentric there pushes up and down the butterfly mechanism, which then oscillates the entire belt system vertically nice and straight rather than pivoting like a modern one. I'd had a modern Shop Fox edge sander prior to that, which worked fine, except it only ran at 1 speed, full speed, which had repeatedly yanked small parts out of my hands and liked to eat fingerprints. So I wanted to find one that had a 3-phase motor because then I could put a VFD on it and get variable speed control. So I can run this thing down to about quarter speed or so just fine. Obviously it doesn't sound quite as fast, but much safer and easier to control things at that point. Then just a basic Grizzly spindle sander. And then my first planer was this Grizzly G0453PX, your standard 15-inch Grizzly, 3 horsepower with the spiral head in it. It's been great for years for me, except relatively recently I found this Delta 24-inch which actually still has a spiral head on it. Not quite the same insert style that the modern ones have, but nice steep shearing action on it. But I need to refab the head cover on here because at the moment it just dumps the sawdust back under. It doesn't really do anything for helping me vacuum it out, so I need to modify that to put a dust chute on it so I can actually pull the chips out properly. Not entirely sure if I'll keep the Grizzly after that. There's really not a whole lot of reason to do so, I don't think. But haven't gotten rid of it just yet because it's still the easier planer to use at the moment. More storage, just big shelves full of random odds and ends that are a little bit more organized than they look like they are. At least I generally know what's on there and where it is. And then if the camera will cooperate, we've got the Northfield 16-inch joiner. Just 3-blade straight knife. I may convert it to spiral head one of these days, which would be nice, except a spiral head for it's like $1,600 or $1,700, so it hasn't quite become important enough to do so. The blades really aren't that hard to sharpen once you get used to it. And sometimes if I'm doing the same sort of material over and over again, I'll set up this power feed on it. Doesn't work quite as well as you'd like just because the wood can vary in thickness a bit, and it's got maybe an 1/8 to 1/4 inch of sweet spot variance possible. But overall, it'll make pretty quick work out of joining a whole big stack of lumber. And does need reconnected to the dust collector piping up top. I recently moved to this location to fit more shelving in and just haven't gotten around to reconnecting that yet. More storage, random odds and ends, grinder wheels, tapping heads, DROs, precision straight edges, sandblasting hood, whole bunch of random odds and ends. Some of the clamps. Really need to collect all that back together better. And then the Delta planer is currently sitting on one of my more useful machines, which is a powered pallet jack. I probably would not have everything in here without that because it makes things a whole lot easier to move when they're north of 1,000 pounds. And as promised, the cat made another cameo. And then currently working on getting things set back up. We've got my CNC corner, I guess you'd call it. Got a shop-built CNC. This one's about 12.5 by 12.5 by probably 4 or 5 inch working area, but built very stout so I can crank the acceleration speeds up. And when I'm doing like 2.5 dimension carving on here, that'll actually hold about 250 to 300 inches per minute sustained while carving, which is definitely better than the one I had before. It could only do maybe 50 inches or so, which obviously takes a good bit more time then. And then we've got the Milltronics Partner1, which when I got it worked great, despite being a mid-90s machine, other than having to replace the monitor on it. It's a 15 horsepower spindle with a 12 tool changer, Cat 40, and 16 by 30 inch working area on there. But one of the servos went bad shortly after I got it, so I've had to replace that, and I'm still working on getting the wiring all back set up again. Hopefully have that back up and running soon because it's definitely nice to have. And I've got a few projects that are waiting for it. Let's see, coming back around, we've got just your basic WoodTech 20-inch disc sander. I think 3 horsepower. Nothing particularly unique there, but I definitely like a disc sander better than an edge sander a lot of the time, especially with small parts, because the sanding motion pushes things into the table instead of out of your hands. So a little bit safer to run that. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything in the workshop. If you see there's a notch cut out of the doorway, I've normally got a little door there I'd pulled out the other day, but that is because the Milltronics did not actually fit in the door. So the option was leave it outside or cut the doorway, and cutting the doorway one out on that one. Then there's a bit more outside, horizontal bandsaw, the sandblaster rig and so on, but it's dark out, so I'm not going to bother filming that tonight. If you have any questions about any of these machines in more detail than I've gone over so far, feel free to ask and I'll answer whatever I can. I think I know mostly everything I've got in here and how to use it and all that, so I can probably answer whatever questions you have. But what the heck, it'll be fun if someone can stump me.